I'm an artist. Not a very good one at that either. When I say starving artist, do you picture some attractive dude living in a rustic apartment with sad and beautiful paintings? Well, I'm not that. My tiny flat is the attic of some crappy apartment building. Everything is dirty and broken while my fridge has nothing but bread and an old piece of cheese. I used to have a side job, a 9-to-5 office job. Doesn't really matter what my role was. I'm still dirt poor. And I sighed again as I stared at my wet canvas. It was a dreary landscape that was just boring to look at. I even yawned as I got up to stretch. One thing I never noticed before, until it was too late, was the building next door's Gargoyle. It was a very old building with that gothic and fancy architecture. Whatever. It's a bank now. The gargoyle in question sat right opposite my window, where I often painted. It stared right into my home like it was watching me. It was either a serpent or a dragon with a sneering face. In its heyday, it must have been shiny and terrifying, but now it was a greenish brown, and just asking to be spray painted. A friend of mine had pulled some strings for me, and tomorrow night I could display one of my works in a gallery. But he could only manage one. He sold me as an unknown up-and-comer. But since the event planner had never heard of me, I was only allowed a small space. I could go on a rant about the unknown part, but I don't have time. I needed something that will get people's attention, and my old stuff wouldn't do. So I tossed my landscape aside and started over. My leg bobbed up and down as I thought. Eventually I thought about the city I currently lived in and started painting. I tried to capture a lit city full of bright lights, but its citizens were hopeless and hollow. I looked back and nodded. This was something at least. The next night I got dressed in my best clothes and a winter jacket, my art wrapped tightly in a protective bag. It was snowing heavily, but I kept moving, finally arriving at the gallery. But there was nothing. I let out a string of curses as I walked back home, the wind now howling. Not one person showed interest in my piece. I was so angry I threw the canvas aside and stormed onward. Billy, my connection to the event, had been no help at all. He had spent the entire evening talking up the other featured artists. When he finally graced me with his presence, all he did was criticize me over the lackluster message of my work. I wanted to be angry at the people at the event, and Billy, but I was quite angry at myself. I was missing something. A muse, a reason to paint besides starvation. There was nothing behind my work, and anyone could see that. I was washed up. I got to my apartment tired and cold. I reached into my pockets to retrieve my keys. I checked my other pocket and started to panic. I checked every opening and hole in my clothing, but I couldn't find them. I was locked out of my building during a snowstorm. I started banging on the door, hoping someone would hear me, but it was almost midnight, and the icy winds deafened my cries. And so I kept banging on the doors, trying to break the glass, but I was getting so tired. After some time struggling, I sat down, curled up, and pulled my jacket closer as I shivered. I didn't want to die, not like that. My body was going numb, but I could still feel my lips cracking and turning blue. I wheezed, and then it was as if something had heard me and dropped down into the snow. It sounded heavy and it fell from a distance. I couldn't see well because the cold made it too sore to move, but a great beast stood in front of me. My vision was blurry. It looked like a stone dragon. I was frightened, but I couldn't move. It was like I was frozen to the steps of my building. And then it spoke to me. Its voice was deep and gravelly, but somehow I could hear everything it said as if it were speaking into my mind. I will spare your life from the cold, but you must never tell another of my existence. It boomed and I just stared at it, shivering. Swear to me, it bellowed. I promise, I screamed, then coughed. I looked up, but I could barely see anything as everything faded to black. I promise. I shot up, panting with sweat dripping down my forehead. My heart was racing and I nearly jumped out of my skin when a hand touched my shoulder. To my complete shock, the most beautiful woman I had ever seen was sitting next to me. She had dark brown skin that looked as smooth as silk, light brown eyes with flecks of gold. Her beautiful face was framed by tight black curls. I gulped and coughed. "Oh, easy, honey," she whispered, patting me on the back and then offered me a cup of tea. "Thank you," I whispered as I sipped the tea and looked around. I was back in my apartment. It had been filled with candles, making the room warm and casting a romantic glow. "Who are you?" She smiled at me. "Well, I'm Virginia. I found you outside and brought you back up here. You nearly froze to death out there." I remembered being so cold and that creature. I started to shake so hard I nearly spilled my drink, but Virginia steadied my hands. "It's all right," she comforted me. "You're going to be okay." "How do you know where I live?" I asked the first question that popped into my mind. "I'm often around, so I've seen you come in here a lot." She shifted, then pressed her palm flat against my forehead. "Your fever broke. You should probably eat something." She got up and went to my kitchen. With her back turned, I put the tea down and rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't dreaming. I'd almost died, and now I had a gorgeous woman nursing me back to health. "Are you an artist?" She returned, holding a bowl. The candlelight made the steam dance off the hot liquid. "No, I'm a hack," I snorted, the wounds of my recent failures still fresh. Virginia picked up the landscape I had discarded yesterday. At least, I think it was yesterday. Well, the day before the art gallery. I just might disagree with you. You clearly have talent." "Yeah, well, talent ain't enough in this day and age," I grumbled. "Oh, it's good. You're just missing a spark." She looked at me. "Tell me, why do you want to be a painter so badly?" I swallowed a spoonful of soup she made as regret washed over me. "When I was young, it made me happy. I wanted to paint the next starry night. And every time I look at that piece, I feel so calm and then sad when I think about all the torment Van Gogh was going through when he was alive. And yet he created some of the most beautiful works humanity has ever known." I trailed off for a bit, then came back to reality. "But now I do it for money since I can't find any work." I suddenly felt so hollow, realizing just how pathetic I'd become. But then Virginia took my hands in hers. "Well, maybe you just need to try something different." She got up and handed me my sketchbook and a charcoal stick. "Here, draw the first thing that comes to you." I gave her a weird look, but I just couldn't turn her charm down. For a few agonizing seconds, I just stared at the stark white paper with no idea. Then I glanced at her. She was so beautiful, but could I actually capture her beauty? I started by drawing the shape of her face, and before I realized what I was doing, I was sketching her profile. I started at the rough sketch, then at her. "Don't move." I leaped out of bed, then hobbled over to my easel. I faced her while she sat on the bed. The flickering candlelight made her look divine. almost like her skin was made of bronze. She sat there for a minute as I entered a frenzy, and by some miracle, I painted her, and it was incredible. I truly had been missing a muse all of my life. Virginia was like some kind of wish come true. I couldn't stop painting her over and over, different poses, different locations, but always with that beautiful smile on her face. My life did a 180. My artwork got noticed and I became famous. I earned enough money to feed myself a good meal every night and then fix up the apartment until it was cozy as the home I grew up in. I married Virginia a month after meeting her. I couldn't picture my life without her, and I gave her a modest but beautiful wedding. Before our first anniversary, Virginia gave birth to our daughter, Mila. The next year we had Sam, another girl. I could barely understand how I got so lucky with my wife. But the only thing that plagued my good life was my nightmares. Almost every night I had a nightmare where I froze to death, and I always woke up shaking. I also could never forget about that horrible face of the monster. It was always there somehow in a dream. It ate away at me, but I was too scared to ever break my promise. Over the years, I managed to convince myself all of it was just PTSD from nearly dying. But still, I could risk speaking about what really happened that night. Virginia handed me a glass of wine and cuddled up next to me. My life was perfect, yet I couldn't shake that awful, nagging memory. I kept my promise. I never told a soul. But Virginia was my wife, married for 8 years, and gave me 2 perfect little children. I trusted Virginia, and she would know my every secret, even if it was a fever dream. Darling, I looked down at her laying on my lap. Yes, baby, she hummed. Do you remember how we met? She chuckled. Well, you almost died. It's a little hard to forget. Well, I don't remember much, but there's always been one thing that I could never forget. A chill ran across my forehead and I shuddered. Virginia sat up and cupped my face. Hey, you worry too much. Let's just finish this great wine and fall asleep watching a movie. Virginia, it's nothing, I chuckled. Before you saved me, I had this weird fever dream that this monster appeared and told me he wouldn't let me die. I tried laughing it off, but Virginia got off the couch and stood in the middle of the room. Baby? I blinked, confused. It's all right, it's just a fever dream. I got up when I realized that she was crying, but by the time I reached her, she was sobbing. Virginia, what's wrong? I tried to pull her into my arms, but she moved me away and kept her hands over my face. Virginia, really, honey, you're scaring me. You promised, she screamed, dropping her hands and revealing her face. It was cracking, as though she were made of porcelain. You broke your promise to me. The rest of her body continued to crack and fall away. I was too shocked to move, but as she changed, my apartment suddenly felt so cold. I watched my wife grow in size until her face fell away to reveal a stone dragon-like appearance. It's you! I cried in horror and shock as my Virginia, my perfect and beautiful Virginia, shattered and broke away into the monster I saw that night when I nearly died. Why? Why? She cried in a more gravelly voice. Why couldn't you keep your promise to me? I dropped to the floor. I was so cold I couldn't move. My limbs felt like they were freezing, and I heard screaming coming from my children's room. No, not them, I beg of you, Virginia, please, not them. Despite how painful it was, I moved my body to drag myself to their room, but instead, I saw 2 little gargoyles enter the living room. No, I coughed hard as my children ran to their mother. I could stop this, but I felt so cold. I hadn't ever been this cold ever since that cursed night. They looked so scared as their mother painfully sprouted wings from their back. No, I'm so sorry, I begged. Virginia approached me, a child on each hip. Virginia, I stuttered, I loved you. And I loved you, she said, tears falling from her eyes. I watched you for years from that roof. She looked up through the windows to the building next door where a statue once sat. I had always loved you, but you sealed our fate. Virginia, she expanded her wings, then with our children clinging to her, she took flight and broke through the window of our apartment. I coughed violently and watched my wife perch herself on the edge of the roof, assuming her old pose. Mila and Sam, still crying, held on to their mother until all 3 of them became statues once more, each of them looking down at me with saddened expressions.